Hi, friends. I'm Father Kerry Walters, pastor of Holy Spirit American National Catholic Church, and this is another Holy Spirit moment. This one about a stolen basket of pears. The thief in question was no less a figure than St. Augustine of Hippo, who died in the year 430. He writes about the thievery in his Confessions, a book written when he was about 40 years old. Many commentators consider it to be the first autobiography in the Western canon. But whether or not that's true, one thing is clear. The Confessions is a classic and deserves to be read by everyone, regardless of whether you're religious or not. It is simply a beautiful and insightful read. The description of the pear theft occurs in Book 2 of Augustine's Confessions. The story goes like this. When he was around 16, he was in the habit of hanging with a rowdy gang of teenage boys. And one night, perhaps because they were bored, they decided that they would loot a pear tree that belonged to someone who lived in the town in which the boys also lived. They didn't rob the pear tree because they found the fruit delicious and tasteful. In fact, the fruit seems not to have been very good at all. They robbed it simply for the sake of robbing it, and eventually wound up throwing the stolen pears to hogs and pigs. Now, for a space of 5 or 6 pages in Book 2 of the Confessions, Augustine obsesses over this action committed when he was an adolescent boy, leading many readers since the time to wonder why. After all, stealing a basket full of pears from a not-so-healthy pear tree by a bunch of teenage boys seems, in the grand scheme of things, a rather mischievous small act. Why in the world would the adult Augustine return to it and obsess over it? Well, it seems that Augustine can't get it out of his mind because he's puzzled by his motive for committing this particular act. He tells us in Book 2 that most criminal acts are performed from one or two motives. Either one is trying to protect what one already has and does so by criminal means, or one is trying to grab something that one doesn't have but desires and does so by criminal means. But it's clear that the theft of the pears falls into neither of those two motive categories. Augustine did not find the pears desirable, and he certainly wasn't trying to protect anything that he already had. So neither of those motives seem to fit the deed. Well, then, Augustine says, perhaps the cause of my stealing the pears goes deeper than that. Perhaps there's a kind of metaphysical reason for it, a metaphysical motive. Perhaps it was an act of rebellion against God. God is omnipotent, and compared to God's power, my human agency is puny and trivial. So perhaps just out of sheer pique, out of sheer spite, I was trying to defy divine omnipotence by exerting myself, by showing God, as it were, that I too can do something. But even that motive, although it might come closer to the truth, doesn't seem to satisfy Augustine in the long run. And he tries to explain why in a really telling paragraph in Book 2 of the Confessions. He writes this. Speaking to the reader, he says, "Let my heart tell you what it was seeking there in that orchard, that I became evil for no reason. I had no motive for my wickedness except wickedness itself. It was foul, and I loved it. I loved the self-destruction. I loved my fall, not the object for which I had fallen, the pears, but the fall itself." And just a few sentences later, Augustine will describe that fall into wickedness as a fall into nothing. The theft was nothing. The object taken was nothing. The motive was nothing. And as a consequence, Augustine was left miserable by the deed itself. So miserable that he returns to it again and again as an adult. Now, what's going on here? I think his use of the word nothing is really significant. Because what he seems to be implying is that an act of wickedness can sometimes look absolutely attractive to us because we have within us a deep-seated perhaps, but nonetheless constant yearning for, craving for decreation, destruction, the void, nothingness. It's difficult to understand where this deep-seated yearning might have come from. Augustine, for example, said that it was the result of original sin. 1600 years after Augustine, the psychologist Sigmund Freud will argue that it's a manifestation of what Freud calls the thanatos principle. That is, that we human beings, while we crave and enjoy life, likewise have an almost irresistible inclination towards destruction and death. But another reason why I think Augustine calls this fall into wickedness a fall into nothing is his understanding of what wickedness is. Wickedness is literally, for Augustine, a nothing. It is very real, but it doesn't exist. And it doesn't exist because God couldn't have created it, because God is all good and cannot create anything that's wicked. And so wickedness is literally a hole or a rent in the fabric of plenitudinous being that God has created. It's like a hole in one's shirt. It's an impairment, an blemish in the shirt as a whole, and yet it can't itself be called part of the shirt. That's what wickedness is. It is real, but it is a nothing, a no thing. And we seem to have, if Augustine and Freud, for that matter, are correct, we seem to have a rather perverse attraction to it that we really need to resist, because the more attracted to the nothingness of wickedness we are, the void and the chaos of wickedness that we are, the further we remove ourselves from the source of all that is, from the source of the plenitude that creation is. And that source, of course, is God. There's another way of looking at this as well. Whenever I read this passage from Augustine's Confessions, I think of the book of Genesis, the very beginning of the book of Genesis, as a matter of fact, when we're told that God hovered over the void. Well, the Hebrew for that is tohu vavohu. It means chaos, the void, swirling disorder. That's the way things were before God fashioned regularity and law and meaningfulness, before God somehow grabbed the void, the tohu vavohu, and formed it into something that is significant. We might, because we come from tohu vavohu, have an affinity to it, again, buried deep down inside us, that occasionally comes out. And when it does, we perform wicked acts, acts of nothing. And those acts of nothing can range from the seemingly trivial ones, such as stealing pears as an adolescent boy, to actions that aren't at all trivial, like committing violence against either others or ourselves. There's another aspect to all of this that Augustine discusses in Book 2 that I think is significant as well. He says at one point that he doubts he would have stolen the pears had he not been with this gang of rowdy adolescents, that they somehow egged one another on to do what they otherwise might not have done had they been by themselves. Now, I suppose if we were cynical, we could say that what Augustine is doing is trying to dodge some of the responsibility for the action, but I don't think that's what he's doing. I think he's pointing out what we recognize, I think, now from a sociological and psychological perspective, that when we are in a group, if we're not really careful, we can adopt the mentality of that group. And if the group is a mob, then we can adopt that mob mentality as well. The American theologian Reinhard Niebuhr made precisely that point in a book that's become a classic of American theology, Moral Man and Immoral Society. He argues in that particular book that as individuals, we tend to be relatively moral persons. But once we begin to act as members of a collective, that morality seems to go by the wayside, and it's replaced with expediency, if not something worse than that. So, my friends, it seems to me that we ought to take the story of Augustine's thievery of pears seriously, that he's not merely obsessing in a kind of neurotic, guilty way over an action that no sane person ought to consider more than once or twice, that in point of fact he sees this seemingly trivial action performed when he was a youth as the first stirrings of that horrible, horrible affinity with nothingness, with tohu vavohu, that humans carry deep, deep inside ourselves. And as a consequence, Augustine recommends that what we do is to try and displace that craving for chaos with a craving for the source of everything that is, namely God. I'm Father Kerry Walters, and this has been another Holy Spirit moment. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.